This country has seen polarization before, never at this level, and we don't want to tip into civil war. When there's a taste for outrage, a taste for retaliation, when they get that kind of fix from the media, it stimulates parts of the brain that are also stimulated by narcotics. Politicians understand that, the media understands that, marketing understands that.
Welcome to the Astin-Gregory podcast, the show where we explore how to live free and prosper in a changing world. We're on a mission to reach over 50,000 subscribers so we can reach more people with our bold, thought-provoking conversations. And since last week's episode, over 300 of you have hit that subscribe button on YouTube. If you're one of them, thank you. And if you haven't yet, then I'd like to invite you to do that now. When you subscribe, here's my commitment to you. Each and every week, we'll bring you courageous guests and deep insights to help you navigate these changing and uncertain times. So if you're with us, hit subscribe now and let's build something that truly matters. Today's episode couldn't be more relevant to our mission. America is once again on edge. The latest LA riots have erupted, once more revealing the deep fractures running through society, fractures that go far beyond the old notions of left and right. We're living in an era where nearly every topic, from science to education, health to history, has become politically charged. We saw this firsthand during COVID. Like many of you, we dared to ask evidence-based questions, and we were not met with dialogue, but rather derision. Families split, friendships ended, rational debate gave way to tribalism and moral panic. So how do we get here? Why is society so addicted to outrage? And is there a way out of this polarization trap? Today's guest is one of the world's foremost experts on conflict resolution and social psychology. Dr. Peter T. Coleman is the author of The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, and a professor at Columbia University, where he leads the Difficult Conversations Lab. His work combines neuroscience, complexity science, and decades of field work to understand how societies can break out of entrenched conflict. This is not just about America. This is happening all across the Western world, and the stakes could not be higher. So if you're exhausted by the division, but still believe in the possibility of healing the fabric of society, then this conversation is for you. A quick time out, because if you've been questioning the systems shaping our world, then you'll love what we've created with The Thinking Society. The Thinking Society is a 6-week online course designed to help you sharpen your critical thinking, spot bias and manipulation, and make sense of the chaos without losing your mind or your relationships. You'll learn directly from brilliant minds like Sinead Stringer, David Charalambos, and Dr. David Thunder, and join a community of people who actually want to think for themselves. Head to weareelevate.org/thinking society or hit the link in the description to learn more and sign up today. Now back to the conversation. Peter, it's great to have you here on the show. We began this show back in 2020 looking at some of the dynamics within the pandemic response. And for me, that was one of my first exposures to the radical polarization in society. During that time, families, friends were torn, divided. Some even called for the segregation of society based on their medical choices. And I became deeply shocked at how far the polarization had become during that era, and how rational debate, nuanced conversation, evidence-based discussion was cleanly wiped from the table and replaced with oversimplified, grand, polarizing narratives that divide. And of course, this wasn't the first time. I'm based in the UK. I'd witnessed the kind of polarization of the US political paradigm for the last decade, but we've not really had it so close to home since COVID. We've got a slightly different environment here, but it seems that since 2020, right through to the present moment, the polarization has risen, and it feels almost untenable right now. This society is divided almost plainly in half, in Team A, Team B, on every single issue, and it's causing real ruptures. So my first question for you, Peter, is how on earth did we get here?
Right. Hard question to answer simply, but I'll take a stab at it. I mean, it depends on the we, right? Whether it's the US or the world. What some of the indicators suggest is that really, probably everywhere in the world, there is this inclination to, divide and split and see the other as the problem. Democracies are the most susceptible to it right now. So the Edelman Trust does a sort of analysis of global polarization, and they have all of the more acute nations, including Sweden and the US, but also Colombia, Argentina, and elsewhere, are the most extremely divided societies. The societies that they identify as less so are really all autocracies, which basically means that they can't get information, right? People can't openly say, yeah, we hate each other, or I hate the government, or whatever. So it's, the data is suspect on that. But clearly, there are these fissures that are worldwide, and that are more evident in more open societies where people can express their frustration and grievances. Again, it's sort of rocking us. And the U.S. is both a contributor to that and evidence of that, right? Because we're of the sort of G7 or, sort of the more developed nations in the world, we are in this skyrocketing trajectory really since the end of the 1970s. We've seen indicators both sort of in government in Washington in terms of the inability for people to come together and work across, partisan divides, but also on Main Street. The attitudes about them and them being the problem have just been increasing since the late 1970s. And so this is a long-term problem. And then certain things, the internet, the unregulated internet as a space for, discourse, Trumpism, there are many factors that exacerbate, that really fuel the dynamics that have been happening. And so that gets us to this acute place. But the answers are a little tricky. Again, it's complicated. But this country has seen polarization before, never at this level, right? The U.S. is at an unprecedented level in terms of enmity and hate for the other side, blame for the other side, and the inability of our government to sort of come together and solve problems. We had periods like this, in the 1800s after the Civil War. There was obviously a lot of enmity here. Then at that time, we came out of it in the 1920s and moved into a time of better problem solving in the government. But we definitely are on a dangerous path right now, both in terms of the polarization, but also in terms of illiberalism, just authoritarianism, kind of certainty of our side versus their side, and what drives that. And that is, again, and it's an acute problem. And I would just say that the context for all of this, I think, is uncertainty, right? Is political uncertainty, economic uncertainty. Certainly the Trump administration's current approach to governance is just fueling that. But that uncertainty has been happening for a long time. COVID was part of that. Economic downturns have been part of that. But there is this, and then sort of the rise of AI and, robotics and automation replacing everybody and everything. It's an extremely anxious time for our species, and we're not really good at processing those things with nuance, with context, with historical understanding. And so when we get anxious like that, we simplify, and it's easy to blame on whoever, and politicians, blame it on immigrants or blame it on, whoever the outgroup is, right? Whatever the most convenient outgroup is. And then issues like COVID, which, could unite people, right? You would think that a threat of that magnitude, a biological threat of that magnitude, would unite our country, would unite the world, in service of protecting humans against this onslaught. But it became so quickly weaponized. And that's what we're seeing time and again, is that some challenge happens. Israel-Gaza war, I'm a professor at Columbia University. I'm in the epicenter in the U.S. of university divisions on that issue and the repercussions of that. And again, does it necessarily have to be something that divides a campus or divides a country? But it becomes weaponized, becomes politicized. And then it's not about really that problem, and what to do about it. It's about who has the best, most purist take on the problem at this, at our institution. So that's what you see, is you see these kind of major global problems not uniting us, which often happens, right? In my world, there's a thing called disaster diplomacy. And when you see a tsunami take out an area, you see, previously warring factions kind of put down their arms and say, okay, this is different. We have to sort of come together and, rescue and repair. And that can change the dynamic fundamentally. And some of us had hoped and predicted that could happen with COVID. It didn't. It was politically weaponized immediately, continues to be a source of division. And that's the nature of this depth of polarization and politicization of everything, is that problems, instead of uniting us, are just used as, grist for the mill, opportunities to further divide.
Yeah, I'm curious about that in that sense. I mean, again, as I referenced at the beginning, COVID was that real tipping point for me in understanding that. And I'd be interested to come back to that and look at some of the specific factors that may have played out there that contributed to that. But the idea of crisis itself, I mean, I think it was 2021, the Collins Dictionary termed the word permacrisis as their word of the year, which if and Daniel Schmachtenberger calls it the meta crisis, it's crisis upon crisis upon crisis. And it feels like, I mean, even within that context, it feels like everything is so amplified now and so sensationalized that almost everything feels like a crisis. And even that, I fear, has stemmed from a point where we can't actually have rational discussion about certain things to actually assess the magnitude of certain things versus a competing challenge. But in your view, what role does crisis play in uniting or dividing us? Historically, have crises actually united people, or what we're witnessing is this a typical pattern where people do initially rally together and then break down?
Well, again, yes and no. I mean, I think politicians, leaders can see opportunity in crises, right? That opportunity can be unite, or it can be to, gather power, hoard power, and use it to weaponize. So crises are used in different ways. They're recognized as extraordinary moments. But what we do with them is sort of our choice. I mean, I think one of the problems is that the media ecosystem that we live in, which includes social media and mainstream media, sort of recognize, and so as it's called an attention economy, right? You have all of these different venues competing for attention. And what that industry has recognized, or set of industries has recognized, is that, humans become addicted to outrage, right? They can there is brain research on this where they see, when there's a taste for outrage, a taste for retaliation that people get through a tweet or an X or whatever it's called now, when they get that kind of fix from the media, it stimulates parts of the brain that are also stimulated by narcotics. So there is an addictive quality to this. The media knows this. They oftentimes use it really left and right. They'll use it. It might be the suffering of immigrants, or it might be the immigrants are attacking us, whatever. It is a sense of outrage. And they're aware of that. They know that very well, but that is the basic business model of our media. And you see a lack of regulation on the media. Facebook, Zuckerberg took off the sort of fact checkers recently, and again, sort of under the auspices of free expression, but it's really a business model, right? So, and that form of communication, the ease of that communication, the seduction of that communication, the addiction that we all have to these things, are part of why this is so hard to stop and rein in. Again, some of it is leaders who model division and really see opportunity in crises to divide us and to hoard their own power, increase their own power. But some of it is really how we're communicating the platforms that we're all addicted to, or getting most of our information from, and that's a big factor here. Because it's not just the information, it's also the addiction. And I will say one thing. I saw some interview with Yuval Harari recently where he was talking about the difference between truth and fiction being, stories we make up, and truth being some kind of accurate depiction of the evidence, right? And he just said, truth is harder. It's harder to do. It's more costly. If you're going to do, a good history of the Romans, you have to sort of go really deep, and invest, lots of money and lots of time to get the information accurate, and it's much easier to kind of make up a story. Fictions are less painful to us. People tell us things that we want to hear, and they tell us them in a way that comfort us. I read a book recently about peace, The Cry for Peace, and they were talking about the world having these terrifying simplifiers. That simplification in times like this is very comforting to many of us, right? We just want simple, easy answers, and it does assure us, but it also moves us farther away from an understanding of what's going on. So, truth is more complicated, truth is more expensive. It's just harder. It's harder work. And many of us don't have the energy or the, capacities really to track that. So we prefer stories that comfort us, and the media taps into that.
Quick break to tell you about the Thinking Society, our flagship course to help you reclaim your mind in a world of noise. Over the course of 6 weeks, you'll dive into the psychology of propaganda, cognitive bias, and the war on truth, and how to become radically better at thinking and seeing clearly in a world gone mad. If you're tired of being told what to think and ready to think deeply, independently, and courageously, this course is for you. Go to weareelevate.org/Thinking Society or click the link in the description to join us now. Now back to the episode.
So, these are part of the many dynamics. I'm a social psychologist by training. I study conflict and conflict dynamics, and peace dynamics as well. I study sustainably peaceful societies. But I work with complexity scientists that say, psychology is a part of this. The human psychology and the context that we're in is part of it. But there are a lot of things that come together that drive this, and that's why it becomes such a difficult problem to crack.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on so many important points that I think I've observed myself as well. The oversimplification is one of them, and when you've literally got a platform that take Twitter X, it was literally built on 140 characters originally. You can't exactly, even if you do those, I don't know what they're called anymore, those laddered tweets where you do 10 different 140, you're still only talking
threads. Yes, right.
Threads, yes, small number of tweets.
Yeah.
But in your view, I'm trying to get a sense of what is the kind of primary driver of this systemically. In your view, is the media architecture, the incentive structure? There's the phrase, if it enrages, it engages. Is the business model of the digital platforms, social media platforms, digital media, is that now the primary driver in your view of polarization? Because, and to zoom back a bit, Trump is a classic lightning rod for the idea of polarization. But I look at it and think the man and his actions are almost separate from the media response and social media response to him. And he's just an isolated example. We could pick many others. So part of me wants to draw a line between the individual and their characteristics, and then how the world responds to individuals or storylines or news articles.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, again, I think Trump is a product of the media, right? Trump is president because he was a television celebrity. That's it. So he understands the power of that. I mean, I marvel at how many, what do you call it? Breaking news. How many times breaking news? Right there, President Trump urges Putin to stop. It's like every 30 seconds there is breaking news about Donald Trump, and again, you didn't see this with Biden or Obama. He did nothing at this magnitude. So he is a product of media. He understands it. He manipulates it. He's good at that. He's effective at that. It's part of their the sort of right strategy to flood the zone. They put a lot of things happening simultaneously that keep us sort of distracted and not paying attention to what's happening, but just to it's an overwhelming strategy, but an effective one. So it's, again, I always hesitate to identify the source. because I think these things compound each other. Humans are ethnocentric and tribal. We do have a tendency to, be more comfortable with people like us, and just, that's the most comforting, easiest place to be. Being with people who are different from us politically, religiously, in terms of gender orientation, is more challenging. It takes more work, right? We find comfort in, they call it in psychology homophilia. We're attracted to us, and so there is some innate characteristics to us as a species that is tribal and ethnocentric. And so that's part of what, but again, politicians understand that, the media understands that, marketing understands that. So there are many mechanisms that tap into our human qualities, right? That make us susceptible to this, particularly in times of instability or confusion, anxiety. There is so much anxiety these days that people are looking for simple answers, or looking for strong people that give us the way out, give us the specific, solution to our problems. So it's both. It's who we are, it's the awareness of who we are, and the manipulation of some of our more innate qualities that leads us to be susceptible to these kinds of messages, right? And then leadership matters. And when you have leaders that model contempt and disdain and divisiveness, and that's a primary approach, and that's certainly politically what happens here. I know it happens in the UK. That matters, and that's what young people see. We see, young men in this country more and more attracted to kind of more liberal, autocratic sort of orientations. So that kind of socialization and modeling is a very powerful factor. And is that media? Yes, it comes through the media oftentimes, but it's also a choice of leaders about how they take up power and what they model for the world.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that as a distinct topic later on as we go through this. But yeah, you touched upon, a couple of times there about the times of unrest and kind of what Matthias Desmet would call free-floating anxiety that is pervasive in this period of uncertainty. We're seeing, vast societal unrest in the Western world. We're going through a transitionary period in history, which is driven by multiple factors, including technology, as you touched upon. And it may be difficult to look through the lens of history to see if similar times of unrest have caused such polarization, because there are unique faculties such as, even in the days of the printing press, it's not as pervasive and 24/7 as a mobile phone. So yeah, is this a historical pattern in time? Is it unique to these cycles that we go through, that we see an enhanced level of division and polarization? Is it a function of unrest?
Well, yeah, I think there is, I think of Luddites and industrialization and the sort of pushback against machines and factories. And, there are oftentimes groups that resist change, respond to it, politically or through, more actions of protest. I think we've seen that all along. What's important to recognize, and this is, like Alvin Toffler wrote about this in the 1970s and 80s. He wrote about a trio of books called Future Shock and things like that. And it was really just about the pace of change, right? Change is happening at an exponentially faster rate, right? I was at one of our peace project is funded by Toyota. It's a long story, the Toyota Research Institute. I was at a meeting of the university researchers there recently. And they're all on AI and robotics. That's pretty much what they do right now. And so they were talking about the future of AI, and really that, what we know of as AI now, which has, significantly transformed my life and academia, right? And what we know as AI right now, Chat, GPT, and things like that, they said obsolete in 2 years, completely obsolete. We are going to be at a very different level of AI. And the scenarios, the more terrifying scenarios are that it, sort of learns to learn and learns to code and learns to take care, create itself, basically, So those are terrifying. But the exponential rate of change is what's different. Change happens. there's an invention, it changes how we communicate. It's the monks are no longer controlling the word, but now it's in books and in pamphlets, and so obviously those changes had significant effects, had pushback, but the rate of change now is at such an extreme level, and increasingly so, that we as humans don't really know how to deal with it. There's a developmental psychologist named Robert Keegan who wrote a book called something like "In Over Our Heads: The Challenges of Modern Times." He wrote this 20 years ago, and he really just talked about how both the levels of complexity of the problems we face, the challenges we face, and the world we live in, and the rate of complexity, the rate of change of everything, contribute to a place where, again, it just is overwhelming to us as a species. And so we look for simple answers. We look to simplify. This is the reaction. And that's a psychological defense because we can't make sense of this, right? So, yes, this has happened historically in periods before this kind of innovation or change, but the rate of change, I think, is unique to our time, and again, exponentially growing, right? Yeah. So, and it will change everything. And so, again, even the tendency towards illiberalism and autocracy as a preference for governance right now, which we see in too many places, is a need to go back, to simplify, to have somebody say, we will provide order. We're going to provide a sense of order here. And that is a seductive thing when your world is spinning and changing so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, so much there. I mean, I'm a relatively new parent. I've got a 3-year-old son, and it sort of, when I look at my son and his evolution, it sort of reminds me of societal parallels. Because if my son feels uncertain or concerned or upset, what does he do? He runs to mummy or daddy. That's what he looks for, immediate certainty and comfort.
Yeah.
Despite our evolution, our psychological development, it feels like in the digital realm, especially, I do make distinctions between the physical realm and the digital realm, because if I'm having a discussion or a debate at a restaurant or a cafe or whatever context, there's a more polite decorum that will enable for some level of depth and complexity in conversation, even if we disagree. Because even if and I've had this, I've been in many different polarizing conversations, but in person, there's still a friendliness and politeness, and it's rare that one would storm off and go off or start slinging insults and resorting to ad hominem attacks. And if it does, you get it in a jovial sense. It's particularly amongst fans, it's more playful. But online, it feels like that level of sophistication is not there. And it feels like dealing with toddlers. And as such, it's not surprising that society, and in the face of all this grand uncertainty plus this deep polarization, it is almost reverting to toddler-like behavior to say, I want to be taken care of. I need someone. And to me, it's not even necessarily about a strong leader, but obviously we understand why that becomes appealing to adults. But to me, it does feel like that. It feels underdeveloped as a society that leads to this almost paternal instinct to the nearest form of certainty and tugging at the parent's leg. It feels. Yeah,
I mean, I think what you're just describing though is basic, right? It is. I can't remember if it was Harlow or Bowlby, but one of the psychologists that looked at attachment said, that life is a journey of, sort of starting in a safe place and venturing out with these adventures, but always returning, right? Because we need to have some sense of, where we can settle. Yes. And that's what you're describing. And again, when things get crazy, that's what we do. And that's why you see in places like Sudan, where you have, this long-term chaotic, sort of disastrous set of wars, you see the society, split into small groups that just protect local, are able to protect people locally. And that's the same kind of thing. It's seeking that kind of foundation, sense of stability, security, clarity that helps us and is necessary. And again, if the story that they're telling, that the leaders are telling, is a compelling story, we're susceptible to it. But that's the interaction between, I think, our kind of basic human psychology, which in some ways is just primitive. You just want some sense of safety and security. And in a world where that feels less and less frequent or accessible, we become susceptible to people that say that. And we've known this for a long time.
Yeah.
We've, there were stories here by Milgram, studies in the U.S. by Milgram post World War II called the Obedience to Authority studies, and he was at Yale, and he was interested. This is right after World War II. He was interested in trying to study why the German people were so susceptible to authoritarianism and obedience. Like, what was that about? And so he set up a lab in Yale at New Haven with the intention of studying it and then going to Germany to really get a sense of what happened, what's up with the Germans. He never left New Haven because, it was like it was a human thing. If you have somebody in a white lab coat that says, shock them, we do. So we all have, there are these innate, vulnerabilities, sensibilities as humans that allow us to become, under certain conditions, susceptible to obedience. And that's just, a part of what you're talking about. Some of it is security, but, some of it is, giving our trust to people because we believe they can take care of us.
Yeah. And you put a media system on top of that, and it's the whole problem on steroids. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I want to touch on your book. Your book promises a big idea, The Way Out. It's a bold title, bold promise.
Yeah. That wasn't my idea, by the way. That was the publisher. But yes, you're right.
I love a good marketing hook.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. But it's before we talk about the escape route itself, I'm curious for you to enter into this arena with this book. What was the tipping point that led you to taking on the project of the book? Because it's it's so necessary. But was there a point for you specifically that led you to write this?
Yeah, there was. So it really was. So I've studied conflict and what we call intractable conflict, long-term conflicts that just get stuck in terrible patterns that are traps. And we have a lab at Columbia that's called the Difficult Conversation Lab, where we study people who have opposed views on morally divisive issues and study when those conversations go well or don't go well. And because of that lab, around the time that Trump was running for office and then was elected, what I noticed is that both media, but also what I would say is do-gooders, organizations that were trying to bring Americans together, were coming to us and saying, you study these difficult conversations, this is what we want to do. And they had good ideas, but were not aware of the science behind them. So one group was, I think I write a little bit about this in The Way Out, but it's a group called My Country Talks, started in Germany, but it was an association of, I don't know, at that time, 30 different media organizations that were encouraging people to go on a website to answer some questions about divisive issues. And then they would say, okay, so here's somebody in your neighborhood who has a different point of view on this. Go have a beer or a cup of coffee with them and how to work things out. And again, that's not a bad idea, right? It assumes that if we know each other, it's hard to hate up close, right? That's based on something called contact theory from the 1950s that, there's been a lot of research on. And that, if you have groups of people that don't have much contact, sometimes bringing them together to meet each other as humans helps, right? But under certain conditions, Yes. And one of the conditions is not certainty and rage and deep political ideological differences, right? And so when these organizations would approach me and say, well, we're doing this, what do you think? And I started to realize that they were trying to do good things, but really what they were doing was unethical because they weren't providing the kind of support. They weren't aware of the unintended consequences of what they were doing, right? And that then if one push, they would say, well, yeah, we had these two guys and that blew up and that got ugly and they won't ever talk to us again, So it was like, that's a problem. It's a problem when you take kind of science light and say, well, there's this idea about contact, just bringing different people together. Let's try it. Let's build a thing. Let's have it go global. They were moving into this kind of global launch. And from the beginning said, whoa. What you're doing sometimes is very useful and sometimes is very problematic, and I think you're in that space. And so because of that, I thought, all right, well, I study this, I better offer what I can about what our research and others' research suggests is the nature of the problem, and what can help and what cannot help with this kind of problem. And so that's really what drove that, was the feeling that there were people that were trying to do good things, but that really didn't understand the research, in a somewhat nuanced way. It's not necessarily brain science research, but they were really missing important pieces. And I wanted to communicate that. So that's really what motivated writing the book.
Fascinating. Yeah. There's a few things in there I'd like to draw upon later, actually. Even in the world we live in now today, the concept of group people doing good things can be polarized. So what group A thinks they're doing good things, group B thinks they're doing good things. They're completely off the scale in terms of opposing approaches, and as a result, one person can see that group as evil and vice versa, and so it's really tricky.
It's tricky, and that's the political dimension. The other, there's a great book that I'll recommend to your readers called "The Logic of Failure." It was written in the mid-90s, published in the mid-90s by a German psychologist named Dietrich Dorner. The Logic of Failure, and it begins with the crisis in Chernobyl, and the decisions that happened there, and how that went south, and why that went south, because these were the best minds in nuclear engineering in the nation, and somehow this happened, right? But his premise is that there's probably more harm done in this world by those of us that are trying to do good, but are unaware of the unintended consequences of what we do, than by people who are actually trying to do harm. Because people support us and they love us and they encourage us, and yet if we're not doing it in a way that's cautious and that really pays attention to feedback and makes adjustments, we can do great harm and get away with it because we're do-gooders.
Yes, I mean that rings home, and I've been part of several different movements for the first time in my life over the last few years, and some of the things we've resisted, authoritarianism being one of them, is challenge the own pattern within ourselves, and the idea, you have to confront the authoritarian within, and again, as a new parent, it's difficult. You've got a child that you feel responsible for. You don't want to. I don't want to become too rules based. But I still want to help develop boundaries. So it's very difficult. We have to confront our own patterns that we're actually challenging in the world.
Yeah. It's so great to hear. It's so great to hear that you're learning so much as a parent, right? Because that is this tremendous opportunity, because the stakes get really high, all of our neuroses get turned way up. We recognize our own flaws and how important it is. All of our decisions, it's 100 decisions a day. You're making micro decisions that can matter, But it's a tremendous opportunity to learn. I have two children, and they continue to teach me a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. No credits is up to my point. So I want to make an important distinction in the context of the book. So you talk about toxic polarization. I want to understand and define that firstly, and make a distinction between what is toxic polarization versus, say, healthy political disagreement, because there are the genesis, I would imagine, of what it becomes toxic begins in some sort of possible healthy disagreement. So what are the differences between toxic polarization and healthy political disagreement?
So simply, in a two-party system like the U.S., for example, you need to have checks and balances. You need to have parties that are, more conservative, more progressive, that are challenging each other, challenging policies, and ideally through that process, you come up with more feasible, sustainable, effective policies, right? In the 1950s in this country, there was concern that the political parties at the time were too much the same. There's too much overlap. And people were like, what's the difference? It doesn't, I don't really care who I vote for. It doesn't really matter. Now it matters, right? So polarization, different beliefs, groups that challenge the basic assumptions of the other side is a healthy dynamic, right? It does help society move forward at a rate that's not too fast, but is mindful of the need for stability and the need for change, right? It's sort of what we've been talking about. What happened here is that, again, sometime in the late 1970s, we launched into this dynamic that now has taken on a life of its own. So it's not about problem solving, and it's not about challenging for the greater good. It really is, a process in itself, and it's a runaway train. And because it's not just the media, just the leadership, just our political structures and voting, dichotomous voting for presidents and things like that, there are many reasons it does start to feel like we can't control this thing, right? It is like an epidemic that we're in the midst of. And it taps into these addictive substances that we talk about, outrage and tribalism. And so it is a kind of perfect storm. And that's concerning. And what I differentiate is between what I would call healthy polarization, difference, passionate true believers that challenge each other's respectfully, right? There used to be sort of decorum and protocol in Congress. That's gone, and now it is sort of, Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, called politics, that at some point in the Reagan era said that, well, now this is politics as war. This is really about they're the enemy. Don't talk to them. Don't fraternize with them. Don't hang out with them. Don't have your kids hang out with them. So it really is an orientation to politics that is mean-spirited, filled with contempt, and really about gaining power and not about solving problems. And so we're on this dynamic, this trajectory that is toxic. And I say toxic because it's not good for me to pick this thing up first thing in the morning and have it make me outraged. It's not good for my relationships. We are physically moving away from the other side. We have, our networks. First of all, we're more and more isolated anyway, and we don't talk to them. Right. So the people that we may used to at some point tolerate, hang out with, have a beer with, even though they differed from us, not anymore. Right. So that it contributes to our own toxicity. Our relationships become strained, and we become more alienated from more people. And then again, it affects where we travel, the news we watch, all of these things. And all of this comes together to create a toxic state. And we see it in our politics. We see it in, the governor of Pennsylvania the governor's mansion was burned, firebombed the day after Passover here. He's a Jewish family, and they firebombed the governor's mansion. So, those kinds of things at that level of attention, and at lower levels, where just people on school boards or school librarians are getting death threats, the rise of intolerance, illiberalism, and violent inclinations, it does what a toxic state like this does is it creates what they call stochastic terrorism, which means that when you have such enmity and hate in the system, and you have leaders that espouse that, it basically gives freedom to those who are maybe more mentally unstable, well-armed, angry, and outraged. It encourages them to become violent, right? So you see lone actors or fringe people that are living more on the fringe who are more emboldened to do things that they wouldn't if the leaders said, don't do this, right? Don't do this. This is not our country. This is not what we stand for. So it really just does change the odds that kind of political violence, even if they don't understand it as political, but a lot of it's hate, the odds increase that will happen more and more.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets really tricky, Peter, because in the last 5 years, I've seen burning vehicles, burning buildings, but things just being set on fire and destroyed. But it's not limited to one side of the political equation. I've seen it happen on both sides of the Reds and the Blues, resorting to violent disorder. Yeah. And I've called it out many times on my show and in my social media commentary. But there's always someone always is making a moral justification for their actions, because the problem they're facing is seemingly bigger than the act of criminality in the individual case, and that
Yeah.
continually becomes a justification for that type of behavior.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. The political system doesn't stand up. No political leader is saying, stop doing this. This is not appropriate. But the reality is, I do think in this polarized environment, let's take America right now and the recent issues with like Tesla's being burnt. If Trump then goes on the platform and says, stop doing this, it's probably likely to trigger more of it, frankly, because the people who had, in this case, in this particular example, and I could give examples on the other side of the political paradigm here in the UK, with the police riots and also and defund the police movement over here, which was largely left-leaning. And you've got the same issue. So it's if the person you're rebelling against is then telling you to stop, it's almost like when someone tells someone to calm down. It's like tell someone who's angry to calm down, they're going to get more enraged. So it's deeper, I think. A quick time out, because if you've been questioning the systems shaping our world, then you'll love what we've created with The Thinking Society. The Thinking Society is a 6-week online course designed to help you sharpen your critical thinking, spot bias and manipulation, and make sense of the chaos without losing your mind or your relationships. You'll learn directly from brilliant minds like Sinead Stringer, David Sharalambos, and Dr. David Thunder, and join a community of people who actually want to think for themselves. Head to weareelevate.org/thinking society or hit the link in the description to learn more and sign up today. Now back to the conversation.
When Joe Biden was elected, his transition team contacted me and said that Biden wanted to do this campaign to unite the soul of the country and really sort of pitch the coming together of America. What should he do? And I thought about it for a while, and then I wrote him a long memo and said, not much, because half the country is going to think it's, bullshit. They're going to think that it's propaganda, and they're not going to sign on to somebody who they believe stole the last election, right? So I said what he can do is not make things worse. He cannot lean into divisions, not lean into enmity and blame of the other side, not use that kind of rhetoric, model a way of bringing people together if possible. Those are very powerful things, and then also ultimately have policies that help, the economic grievances and things like that. So there are long-term things that can be done, but that, like him launching a campaign to me was a bad idea, because again, he'd have half the country be like, "Oh, this is great," and the other half of the country think it's propaganda, right? And that's true. I mean, Trump is, fortunately, Trump hates everybody. So he's attacking his own people. He's attacking other people. He's attacking our allies. He's attacking enemies. He's pugilistic. But if he were to say, this event that happened in this governor's mansion is unacceptable, and really sort of genuinely mean that. Again, it's not him standing up for Tesla, which is in his interest, right? But it's him standing up for America, what we represent, violence, the need to really curtail that. That's different. He's not willing to do that. It's too politically costly for him, and he finds it sort of somewhere. I have to say, there's a new book out on neuroscience and ideology, which is interesting, that just came out a couple of weeks ago, which finds that people who are more extreme in their ideologies, particularly on the right, have both a preference for hierarchy and order and security and authoritarianism, and they're really titillated by chaos. Right? There's something. It's a kind of interesting combination, right? In that they prefer order, but they find chaos really kind of fascinating, And so, again, these things are complicated, but leadership matters. How they communicate, how they model, and we're in an era where I have a good, a close colleague named Derek Kilmer, who was a congressman from Washington State, and he was the chair of the bipartisan working group and the bipartisan problem-solving caucus, and was really in the midst of that. Just quit. He's gone now after I think a dozen years in Congress, and he said he wanted to be with his kids and do other things, but it's just not an environment where anybody in the middle can survive. Right, or feel like what they're doing is having any kind of impact or efficacy, because the action and the attention is all at the extreme,
It's all at the edges.
in the extremes.
Yeah. I mean, so this is fascinating to me. I've considered I had an early political experience in my childhood that led me to believe that politics is broken from about the age of 8 or 9 years old. Started watching the 6 o'clock news and my father and seeing these grey-haired men in ill-fitting suits jeering at one another across these green leather benches. And my dad, that's how the government is run. And I thought, that's how you run a country? At like 8 or 9, my brain went, this is wild.
Hey, at least you have questioning. I really respect the ability for politicians to stand up and take questions, right?
Yes.
We don't have that.
Yeah. Although there's a lot of time wasted with pomp and order, but either way, I've been lifelong politically homeless. I've voted for every color of the political red, blue, green, yellow. It's never paid off in either way for me. And I've always been vocally critical. In the last 5 years, I've been vocally critical of both sides. But people are quick to forget. I spent the last 4 years criticizing the Conservatives. And the moment I started criticizing Labour, you're right wing now. It's like, well, hang on a minute. I've literally spent the last 4 years criticizing the blue team. You've already forgotten like 4 years of critique. Like, how did that escape or evade your memory? It's you're right wing now. It's like, hang on a minute. Let's slow down. No, I'm still where I stood. I'm standing where I've been standing since I was a child, politically homeless, unaffiliated, and a disbeliever in the whole system. But nonetheless, what's fascinating, I have been involved in activism on a number of different causes in the last few years. I'd never been an activist prior to 2020. This is a brand new lifestyle for me. But we had a former military strategist as part of our working group, and he told me that in the military, they used to have this concept called the red team. And the red team in military was specifically designed to stress test the strategy of the military on whatever mission they were doing, with the common interest of making sure that whatever deployment they go on, they don't screw it up. So the red team would go there and ask the difficult questions. They would go there and poke holes in the policy, which, of course, if you're the one creating the policy, the human ego goes, it wants to defend itself. But ultimately, the red team in that context was set up to stress test the policy in the interest of the whole. What we have, and I've long thought that should be the role of politics. So the opposing force should be stress testing the policy so that together we forge the best path. But I think the problem in politics is that they're not on the same team. They're not. But bizarrely, this is where I think it even gets more crazy, Peter. I do actually think they are. And the weird thing is that there is a massive divorce between intention and means. So I would imagine the red team and the blue team in the UK, the US probably want a healthy country, physically, financially, happy individuals. Some of my audience are saying no politician actually wants good for their citizens. I get it. I've already just stated my political disillusionment that's been with me since the childhood, but. That it feels we're so divided on the means that we lose sight of the fact that we may even have common values. And it starts to feel like we don't have common values because we're so divided on the means of how we attain something, the policy or the protocol or the communication around it, that we've lost sight that we're actually on the same team. And what's your view on that?
Well, I completely agree with that. I mean, again, it's so hard. I think it's very lonely to be in the middle today, right? There's a film that I'd recommend that a colleague of mine, Van Jones, was in, which is called The First Step Act, and it's so he's a black lawyer and a political pundit, and during the first Trump administration, he got involved in prison reform, and he is a self-expressed, professed progressive activist, has long been black man, interested in prison reform for obvious reasons because of that his race is a significant population in American prisons, and he found common ground with Jared Kushner, Kellyanne Conway. They partnered, and he said, if I sit down with Jared Kushner, there are 1,000 things I disagree with him on. But this was one thing we agreed on. And part of it was that Jared Kushner's father had been in prison. And, Van had long been a sort of prison reform advocate. And so they found common ground, and they basically mobilized a bill that ultimately was passed and Trump signed. And it was the biggest prison reform bill that had happened here in decades. So the film is about Van's experience of this. And part of what happens is as soon as he does this, he gets attacked by the left because how dare him legitimize this administration, right? His position is, what are my what are my choices here? What are my options? And we've actually been able to do something significant. But the cost, it was very costly for him. Obviously, the right has problems with him. But he was really vilified and shunned by his community because of his attempt to do this. So it's very hard in times like this. I mean, as you say something against labor and you're put in a box immediately. There are these like immediate purity tests that we're all suffering from. And it's a very hard time. I mean, I've had a little bit of this just because I'm talking about bridge building and connecting and staying in conversation with the other side. And when I talk to activists, who I respect for what they do, they don't have any passion for this, right? They're not interested in this right now because they'll say, "But what about this? And aren't you legitimizing that?" And my position is, I think F. Scott Fitzgerald said that a first-rate intelligence is the capacity to hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time and still have the ability to function. Right, that we needed to do that. We can really believe that something is hopeless and still try to address it, right? And I think in this country, you have to have two, yes, there are things we need to stand up for and fight and mobilize for, and we don't want to tip into civil war. And they're not all alike. And there is room for compromise. There is common ground, right? But it becomes so hard to see that because if you express that, you're put in a box, right? And that's what you're describing.
Absolutely. I mean, as a social commentator of my work, I can still continue to say positive and negative things about the blue team, the red team in both countries. I can say positive and negative things about Trump. I can say positive and negative things about Biden. I can do the same. But the moment I do, straight away, we live in this caveat culture. I need to list all the other things that I disagree with.
Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Just to appease. They're like, what? It's like this hysterical response. And you get like, I'm unfollowing you. It's like, hang on a minute. I'm just saying that this tiny portion of it I agree with, but over here. And again, it's because as someone who doesn't, I'm not part. I have a football team that I support and have done since I was 5 years old. I'm deeply loyal when I'm in the stadium. I'm cheering away. But I can still have a beer with my friend who sits at the away end, and still.
I agree with you. That's what I mean. Is it is an untenable time to be in the middle. A colleague of mine founded a thing called The Flip Side, which is curates media from the left and the right, and every day puts out a kind of thing on an issue. And at some point, she was promoting this and went on Fox News to talk about it, and she lost, many of her followers, because she had the audacity to do that. Again, it is just an indicator of our times, but it's such a costly thing because anybody trying to hold the middle. I wanted to say just quickly about your point of the red team and activism. I think is a really important thing. Robert Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs, which was a sort of disaster here, intentionally turned to his brother Bobby Kennedy and said, JFK turned to his brother Bobby Kennedy and said, I need you to be the devil's advocate. I need you to sit in the room and find flaws in our arguments and challenge us on anything because you're the only one that can do it because you're my brother, and I can't throw you out. But we need to have more checks and balances on our assumptions because there was a lot of, decision-making processes that were flawed at that time that led to some disastrous policies. So what you're describing as the red team is an awareness of more sophisticated decision-making groups of the need for that. I will say around activism, what I experience on Columbia's campus is that activism is usually about mobilization. It's about getting people mobilized to do something, usually against something else. And one of the groups I talk about in the book is this group of 6 extraordinary women in Boston who are 3 pro-life, 3 pro-choice. They came together and And one of the things they said after going through kind of a painstaking years long process of being in conversation facilitated was that one of the things they appreciated is that they could have more honest conversations on their own side about their own ambivalence about their position, right? And their activism and the consequences of what they do. And that opened up that space to do that. Activism, somebody named Robert Talese writes about effective activism. It says it has two components. One is deep moral reflection and interrogation on your position. Is this the right position? How are we going about advocating for this? What are the consequences of that? The other half is mobilization. Let's go. Let's get out there. And at Columbia, it's all the second part. There's very little reckoning with the moral ambiguity of these issues today and the ongoing war that's there. It is, again, just mobilization. And that's a problem, right? There isn't the recognition for activists to reckon with really their standing on these issues and whether or not they, are seeing clear-eyed what they're advocating for, right?
Yes, and those things often in conflict with the moral argument, the self-reflection. It's very because the mobilization then requires you to go back into the
simplicity. Yeah.
So
nothing more mobilizing than there's an enemy coming for us. We got to take him down. But
that comes back to the addiction part, though, because it's the biochemical addiction to cortisol and dopamine that comes from that outrage, moral outrage. And bizarrely, I joke about it, but the fashion, and I'm not one for fashion. Just anyone can come and look at my wardrobe. Just wear plain black t-shirt, simple. But fashion used to be something that would be seasonal, so you'd have like these big catalogs that would cover spring, summer, autumn, winter, and then that didn't sell enough products, so it then became monthly. There was this new flavor of the month, and literally the term flavor of the month became a thing. Yeah. Then it became a weekly activity, then it's a daily, and then it's like hour by hour the fashion has changed.
Yeah.
So that this kind of shift in emotional reaction towards a fashion can change in an instant, but we've almost now gone from the same with moral outrage. So it's we would once in a year, or maybe a few times a year, there would be a big event that would polarize, and there'd be an outpouring of outrage and division and discussion. Now it's almost it's daily. It's definitely happening daily, but there's almost weekly themes. I went on holiday last week and had a complete digital detox, and it didn't take long to tap in to see what last week's flavor of the week was, to see where the division was. Straight away, there's a new law passed in the United Kingdom at the Supreme Court, and boom, there it is. But then everyone cares about it for a week, having had no prior interest in it before, like literally no prior interest, no prior knowledge, no prior research, but they've got an opinion that they've probably been informed of the people in their own group, as you talked about, rather than actually their own sort of developed thought. And I heard I read about a study the other day that said only 2% of our own ideas come from our own self-reflection. Most of it is from our perceptions of others, and trying to find which group we fit in, and we've got to follow that group even if it's against my core. But now we just have this flavor of the month, and it's outrage after outrage, and again, it's just every week there's another story that just divides, and people aren't even actually I don't think they're even connected with their own values, because we've talked about it on the show several times. It's almost like a great inversion, and I've got a lot of friends on the left side of politics here in the UK, and they call it the lost left. It feels like for them that the traditional values of what were meant to be left wing have been so distorted now that that they've actually lost track of principle, because it's no longer about principle. It's about tribal identity. So this long rant, I suppose, comes to the question for you around, to what degree has things like identity politics and echo chambers made us less capable of handling complexity? And I think of Martin Luther King when he is saying, don't judge a man by the color of his skin, judge him by the quality of the character. We've gone full circle again. It's not about one's character. It's about the color of their skin or their political belief. It's so fragmented that we've lost the character part. So what role do you think this identity politics, echo chambers, in groups, out groups play in reducing our ability to handle complexity?
I mean, again, I think they play a significant role. I wanted to say something related to this, which is a study that a man named Ari Kruglansky, who's a social psychologist, did about activism. What they found is that activism oftentimes requires, in its early stages, a kind of mobilization around harm. You know, they're harming us, or this is harming us, and we really need to sort of take this on. So the introduction of a threat is very important to the mobilization of activists, but it doesn't sustain activists. What sustains a movement is when there is a vision, a positive vision about where we're going, right? And I think to some degree that's what you're talking about. Is we're especially because we're doing this for an hour and then we move on to another issue, right? We don't we're going from one harm to the next, and that's really where we've sort of gotten stuck, is the focus on the threats, and not a sense of like, where are we going and what's the ideal future that we as a whole, in addressing this, can achieve. And what he finds is that the movements that have both a kind of a sense of the threat that we need to address and a vision about where we're going that is promotive and more ideal, they're the ones that can sustain over time, right? Because you have some combination of both, and we've lost the latter, right? We've lost the first part, which I said, which is the capacity to reflect carefully on what is this threat and why is this threat, and do we contribute to this, and how are we going to take on this issue? And we've lost the capacity to have a sense of where do we ultimately want to go, right? And how does this protest, how does this activism help move us in that direction? These are, kind of sophisticated ideas, but the evidence suggests that that's a more effective form of activism, right? It's a more sustainable form of activism.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Serda Popovich, who runs Canvas, which is an activist training organization, that's lesson number one, is, you've got to have a vision of tomorrow, a shared vision of tomorrow, not just be in resistance to something. You need to be standing not just against something, but moving towards something and standing for something.
Amen. Yeah. But as you say, it's hard to do when there's such a feast of things to hate.
Buffet, all you can eat, and you still feel bloated afterwards. It's not helping us get a healthy for our diet, but our physical, mental diet.
Yes.
There's a concept you talk in the book about the idea of attractors, and you mentioned it earlier on, from complexity science, kind of self-reinforcing loops. We may have touched on some of them, but can you walk us through what you mean by that concept of attractors?
Yeah, this came from, again, I work with complexity scientists and this is a concept really from physics, but it's anytime you measure something over time. So you can, there's a colleague of ours named John Gottman who studies marital conflict, and he'll bring people into the lab, and basically he'll have a couple talk about some issue that they have conflict over. Usually it's sex, money, or the kids. That's usually what we fight about in marriages, right? And so he has them pick an issue and talk about it. And then what they track over time for person A and person B in the couple is their emotional state. Do they get into negativity? Do they get into more kind of positive, fun, teasing, whatever, rapport? Or just sort of neutral, mundane stuff. And what he finds is that every couple that comes through, he's done thousands of these, shows a strong pattern, right? In terms of when they're in a conflict, where they move into in terms of their emotional dynamics. And it's not, they could feel anything at any time, but they usually show very strong, coherent patterns of, a fair amount of negativity, some positivity, a couple of mundane things, but that's their pattern. You bring them in next month, same pattern. Bring them in next month, same pattern. Now, again, these are human beings with life. Everything's changing. You could see a lot of variance. You don't, right? I always use the metaphor of my siblings. My siblings are coming in to visit tomorrow. I have a bunch of siblings. And whenever we get together, we're all old now, but it doesn't matter. We still fall into the same pecking order, the same dynamics. My brother, who was a sophisticated Washington Clinton appointee, youngest, he just shuts up and does what he's told. It's like these are patterns that are in us, and they're ingrained. And there's a lot of reasons why that is, but they're very strong patterns. So attractors are just something like the emotions that they were measuring over an hour conversation that become very strong patterns that resist change. And there's a lot of things that affect that: psychological things, social things, economic things. You see it in voting patterns in the US. If you look at where you see red versus blue voting in this country, it's pretty stable across multiple elections, right? So these are just patterns that when you measure something over time, you see as strong, and they actually attract us. So the metaphor is it's like an addiction. When you have an addiction, you shouldn't pick up, you shouldn't use, you're going to lose your job or lose your family or get sick again, but you do it, and you do it again, and then you do it again and do it again. Addiction is an acute attractor. It's a fixed point attractor, and just being in the vicinity of drugs moves you into it. It draws you into it and attracts you. And like that, politics, I mean, it's really what you're describing these days, is this kind of categorization of you're with us or against us is an attractor. And it's a pattern that's really hard to shake. And it's because it's not just me, and it's not just our relationship, and it's not just the media, and it's not just the politicians, and it's not just the policy or the current outrage. It's how all of those things start to line up and make it feel impossible to not go there, right? And those are, again, in physics, what we call attractors. In our lab, the difficult conversation lab, we see these. We bring people in to have these conversations, and some of the conversations go south pretty quickly, right? People get angry about their differences on a moral issue. They get stuck and they can't get out of there. Other dynamics that we see in other, around the same issues are more nuanced. People will feel different kinds of things, sometimes positive, sometimes irritated, sometimes annoyed, but then, kind of amused. So they feel different things. They think in more nuanced terms about the issues that they're talking about. So some attractors are very simple and clear and very strong. Others are more open. And these are different kinds of patterns that you can have, right? And again, just to go with my siblings, I have some siblings where we have very narrow attractors. We quickly fall into, antagonism and competition, and others where there's more kind of nuance for whatever reason, right? And we can feel a lot of different things. Sometimes they piss me off, sometimes they don't. I love them very much. All of that's true, right? So we use the concept of attractors because we got this multidisciplinary team that came together, and we were trying to understand this thing called intractable conflict, long-term conflicts that get stuck for decades. Why is that? It goes against all of our kind of hedonistic motives. If you're miserable and in pain, stop it. But we can't. We get, trapped in these things. Why is that? And one of the concepts that helped us not try to identify the cause, Trump or gerrymandering or our history of politics or the current issues, but really sort of see how they all come together to create these patterns that we fall into again and again. That's an attractor.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm fascinated by what you've been working on within the lab, because this idea of actually getting people together to discuss ideas, I want to just put a frame around some of these things before we learn about more about those conversations, because it's something we've actually been exploring here in the UK as well, what we can do to have common ground conversations. And we've done some experiments on this, and it'd be lovely to swap ideas. But what my observations are, both online and physically, but it's more prevalent online, I think. And it's very difficult because everyone thinks that they are the rational part of the party on the discussion. But if you've got an independent observer that's actually witnessing a conversation, an independent, unbiased, neutral observer can often see that one party is arguing morally, ideologically, sometimes emotionally, and the other party may be relying on things like data and statistics. And we found in our activism, data and statistics are very boring to people. They need a narrative. Data and statistics don't sell. But when you witness that, it feels like they're not actually, if it was a battleground, they're not actually on the same battleground, because one is battling with a moral argument or an emotional, ideological argument, and the other is bargaining on a logical, rational, reason base. And it's not to say that either or doesn't have elements of both, but it feels where there's a disconnect between, first agreeing or debating on the moral argument before you even get to the rational or logic or fact base. Is that something you've witnessed as well, where the fallout happens when you've got one party that is overly ideological and the other one is overly data orientated?
Yeah, there definitely there's a measure that we developed called CARS, which is the Conflict Anxiety Response Scale, And it is based on some work that my mentor Mort Deutsch did. He was a theorist and a social psychologist, but also a psychoanalyst. He'd watch couples, and he would see when they were in conflict and they would get anxious, they would tend to respond in certain ways. And many couples would follow what you're just describing, which is some of us move into our head and become, fact-based and intellectualized, and others just become saturated with emotion, And then you're basically on two different channels, right? You're not talking the same language, and so you just, one sees the other as insane and irrational, the other sees the other as cold and a robot, right? So what you're describing are different kinds of experiences Mort Deutsch observed as a response to anxiety. These are kind of defenses, how we manage when we feel anxious about this difference that we're having. So there is this measure that we have, that we study this, and we find that both of them are problematic, because the more extreme you are on either direction, the more anxious you feel, the lower your positive well-being, the more negativity in your life, right? So being too far, but that there is the capacity for what we call optimality. We're having some combination of both. Feeling the feelings that you have, expressing those feelings, but being able to tap into some kind of rational process, that is more ideal. And what we would call that is, again, the primary thing that we've studied in our lab is the power of complexity. And that complexity can be complexity of emotions. It can be complexity of thought. It can be complexity of behavior, because, in a stuck conversation, you're just arguing for your position. I'm just arguing for my position. And that's where we stay. So it's all about advocacy. And I never say to you, well, what do you think about that? Or tell me more about why is that? Why do you believe in that? And so what we see in our lab is what we would call more optimal ratios of both inquiry and advocacy. You take a position, but then you say, how do you feel? Why is that? Can you tell me more about that, right? So there's that kind of balance. Emotionally, you see enough rapport and friendliness or decency that people can continue the conversation. And occasionally you see people say, well, that really pisses me off because I just think that's wrong. So you see people being able to move optimally between these states, right? And that's what we have found to be kind of a healthier state of well-being and relationships, is if you can move and stay dynamic in them and not just get trapped in one or the other. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. And there's a great book called Difficult Conversations that a colleague of mine wrote at Harvard, who talks about different kinds of conversations that people can have, and whether a kind of moral values conversation or emotional conversation or a kind of fact-based intellectual conversations, and that they're very different conversations or different channels. Ideally, what people learn to do is hold on to all of those in a conversation, right? Or at least be mindful, as you say, of what kind of conversation are we having.
Yeah, fascinating. So I suppose this leads on to talk about some systemic solutions. I want to look at this from a kind of dynamic of systemic and also individual.
Yeah.
We're witnessing a systemic problem with polarization and tribalization and division. In your view, how do we begin to tackle this vast polarization systemically?
Yeah, so I'll talk about, I guess, a couple of what I think are the more impressive initiatives that are out there that I'm aware of or mindful of. Because, to some degree, it is on all of us, right? It's on us to question ourselves, to try to reach out to people who we maybe aren't inclined to reach out to, try to keep in conversation with people who have different points of view. So there is a piece on us, and I can tell a story about that because I struggle with that too. I can tell you my struggles. But at a more macro level, again, it's a tricky thing to do in a time like this where our government structures are so polarized and structured that way. And the incentive systems, right, that you're going to go to the polls and vote for one out of two people just continues to split us, right? Because and oftentimes we're not voting for anybody, we're voting against somebody else. That's the nature of our politics now. But there are groups that I think have been very smart about how they go about this. I just want to tell one story. So a couple of years ago, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund brought a group of people together for a couple of days, and they basically invited all of the major service organizations in the country. So Habitat for Humanity, the YM and YWCA, Mercy Corps, all the Boys and Girls Clubs, things like that. There are all these organizations. This country has a long history and legacy of service. We like to help our neighbors. We like to help build a community garden, whatever, where there are different reasons. And I think about 60 million Americans every year participate in some kind of volunteer or service organization. That's pretty good odds, right? So there is an infrastructure in this country of places where people go to do good for their community or for something, right? It might be emergencies, it might be other things. The Rockefeller Brothers brought together the heads of these organizations in light of the polarization and sort of said, you're doing what should happen, and it's fantastic what you do. Might there be a way that you can be mindful of the power of bringing people together who are different and using these opportunities in a way that just help their understanding of each other? So Habitat for Humanity is an example, right? That's a group that builds homes for the poor. And people are mobilized to do that, and they like to do it. It feels good, it feels right, it feels moral, and it feels decent. And you can use your technical expertise if you have that to do stuff, right? Or learn technical expertise. So it's a movement in this country. What you don't want to do for Habitat for Humanity is politicize it, overly politicize it. It was founded by Jimmy Carter, so it already has that challenge. But it's a thing that Americans do. So how could Habitat for Humanity think about how do they match people? How do they put people together to work in certain projects? Do they have them have any kind of debrief conversation that would be helpful, right? Any way to not move this into bridge building, because that's the kiss of death, right? But enhance what they do in ways that are mindful. So they had two academics come to this group, me and a woman named Linda Trop. Linda has done a lot of work on intergroup contact and the value of that, and bringing people together across differences. So she gave her talk on that. And then my job was to say when it doesn't work, and the things not to do, right? And not to lean into it too much and not to have it become political. So she talked about the power of it. I talked about the conditions under which it actually works, right? And then they all went off themselves and thought about what might they do, could they do in their organization, not to diminish or adversely affect what they do, but to maybe enhance what they do and enhance the capacity to help people understand each other across our differences. And so this was a 2-year project, and they put out a report not too long ago about the impact of this. And to me, this is like a fantastic example, because it's not saying, okay, I have to say one thing, God bless billionaires, but I had a few billionaires contact me when I wrote this book and say, look, we're going to do a dialogue project, and we're going to bring Americans together and every community, and we're going to do this and do this. And so I'd listen to their ideas. They're all warmed over ideas that they have no idea are warmed over. And so then I would have to say, fantastic. I'm really happy you have passion for this. There are 8,000 groups in this country that do that. And if you go to this web page called the Bridging Divides Initiative, there's a map, and it will show you all of those initiatives. What you could do is figure out how can you help those organizations scale what they're already doing and have better impact what they're doing, either with resources or communications or something, right? That's what you could do. Most of them weren't interested in it because it's not their thing.
Yes.
But to me, it's so simple. There it is. And what this group, Rockefeller Brothers, did is exactly that. They said, there are these service organizations that get 60 million people a year talking to each other and working together physically, oftentimes on doing things, helping the community. Are there ways that we can enhance that to make it have kind of sustained long-term effects on their attitudes towards people that are different from them. So to me, that's what's key. That dialogue groups, there's a lot of dialogue groups in this country, Braver Angels and, whatever. They're, I think, good actions. They're important, but what they tend to do is they get progressives. So the blue people show up, very few red people show up. It's a hard sell because people on the Republican side smell a rat. They think they think this is propaganda. And to some degree, it often is. We're trying to get people to change their minds. And so bridge building is a hard thing to do right now in this time. It's not unimportant and it can move the needle, but it also tends to be episodic, right? I'll go to a dinner and have a conversation with people and it might feel good, but it's 90-minute experience I have. And then I go back to Fox News and Breitbart and there I go. So it's not sufficient enough. And this is one of the things that the research and contact theory tells us is it's not one-time contact. It's ongoing, oftentimes mundane contact that you have with people who are different from you that transforms your relationships and your understanding of them and even insight into their politics and where they come from, right? So the Rockefeller Brothers Fund initiative that I refer to is one example of going to where people go anywhere. Robert Putnam talks about this, that he writes about the need in American society for groups like the Boys and Girls Clubs, where people come together across their differences. And that's been waning in this country. It's been less and less. And so, religious groups, they're in the decline here, right? So finding where people do go and connect and could better understand each other and enhancing those capacities, to me, that's the best bet right now in the current environment.
Peter, it's fascinating to hear the nature of those projects, Peter, and I think people can get involved with those things to actually participate in those types of dialogues. But bringing it back to the individual, what can individuals start to do to embrace that complexity that we've been talking about, rather than defaulting to the simplified, tribal narratives? How can individuals, what can individuals do to start to break this pattern?
So the first thing I would say is read my book, which I have to make a pitch, but
Awesome.
Understanding that that's unlikely for many people. But I'll tell you a story. And so I wrote an account of this in Time Magazine a year and a half ago or something. And so we can, maybe you can offer a link to that because it's not a book and it's, free. But this is an experience that I had because about a year after I wrote the book, I was working with some of my students and colleagues and trying to figure out how do we take this idea of the way out, which has kind of 5 principles. If you're going to meet somebody who's politically different from you, don't go into it on automatic pilot. Be more intentional. Think about what you want to do, what would be helpful. Try to find your better self in that encounter. Try to be open to more, to their story and hearing their context and maybe sharing your context, those kinds of things. So there's a kind of a set of principles that we came up with. But, what I realized is people don't read books anymore, and that we wanted to create something that would be more of a challenge. So we actually created these, different, what we call nudge exercises, these daily exercises. We put it up on a website that's now called the Builders website, and it was the Polarization Detox Challenge. It was a 4-week challenge. Every day you get a text, and it says, here, you can do this. It'll take you 5 minutes. Build up your own capacities for your self-awareness, your ability to reach out to people who are different from you, your ability to be honest with people who are politically like you, right? And to have more candid conversations with your in-group. And then ultimately find these organizations, at a community level. So we were doing that. We were working on this. And then I thought, okay, I got to do this. This is great. I wrote a book. I got these exercises. I'm promoting this. Is there somebody in my life that I've really become politically estranged from? And of course there is. And one person came to mind who was a neighbor of mine who is in this. So I live in a building in Manhattan, on the Upper West Side. And there's a man that I've known for 15 years and saw him with his children and grandchildren, know him to be a decent enough guy. We just know each other casually. But a couple of years ago, after Trump was elected, he started to, this is the first time Trump was elected, we'd get on the elevator and he would provoke me. He would say things that I thought were initially just irritating, about are you in that climate march, that nonsense, that kind of stuff. But then it became more, to me, insane, where he was really saying, that Putin, he is a leader. He is my kind of leader. And so it got to a point where I realized he was just trying to provoke me. This isn't going anywhere. So I, for about a year, said, I'm done. And I just disengaged from him and really intentionally just stopped talking to him. He'd try to provoke me. I'd say, nothing and leave. And it was awkward, but, I just made a choice that this was going nowhere. And then I wrote this damn book the way out, and I thought, okay, I gotta try to do this. So about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I decided to reach out to him, and I emailed him and said, would you be willing to take a walk with me in the park? We live near Riverside Park, and, can we take a walk one day? And he wrote back right away and he said, I'm happy to have a conversation with you, maybe sit on the bench. Why do you want to walk? Are you CIA? Are you afraid of surveillance? He was really genuinely paranoid because why am I doing this, And I said, I'll explain to you. It'd be great if you would be willing to take a walk with me. I can tell you why, and, and would you be willing to do it? He eventually agreed. So, I prepared to do this. I have to say, I was very anxious about it. Like, I've been a mediator of different types. I've been in rooms with people threatening each other. But when it's you, and your community and your differences that are so antagonistic, so I was sort of sick to my stomach and anxious about it. But I really had to sort of say, again, why am I doing this? Like, what do I ideally want to achieve here? Because I'm not going to change his mind. So what's the point of this? And I had to get clear on that. And then, like, how do I do this in a way that would be helpful? So I was basically following the guidelines that I'd written. We met in the bench out in front of our building. He was clearly nervous too. He immediately said to me, yeah, happy to do this. My wife isn't feeling too well, so I may have to cut this short. I won't have a lot. I said, okay, no worries. Let's see how it goes. Yeah. And he wanted an out, right?
Yeah.
But he agreed, and we went for a walk. And the first thing I said to him is, can you tell me who you are? Because the truth is, I don't know you. We've known each other, but where are you? Where do you come from? And so he told me his story. And again, at this point, we're walking towards the park and then in the park. And he told me his story. And it was kind of an extraordinary story, a really interesting story. He was born in France. His grandfather was a big rabbi in France, established a community there. And then he grew up in London. Now he's here. So, really interesting story. And part of what his story informed me about is where his values come from and how they align with Donald Trump, which, again, I didn't know. I really had no sense of who he was. And then he said to me, who are you? And so I told him who I was, where I came from, very different kind of background, but not what he expected, I think. My background is more humble than maybe I appear today. And one of the things he learned is that I'm not Jewish, but my wife's mother was. And so that came up, and he said, oh, so your children are Jewish? And I said, yeah. And of course, that mattered to him, right? Finding some kind of common connection like that mattered. Anyway, so that's where we started, is sort of sharing our stories, right? And then at some point he said, so what do I'm assuming you want to talk to me because you don't know any Republicans you can talk to. And I said, well, no, that's not true. And he said, well, I assume, well, you don't know any Trump's loving Republicans. I said, well, that's true. So, then I said, and again, this is a technique. I said, can you explain to me why you feel such support for Donald Trump? And then he went off. And again, now we're walking. And he went through all of the Breitbart, New York Post, Fox News talking points of Obama and, Soros being the devil. And, so he just went through all of the talking points that, we're familiar with. And as we're walking, he gets more and more kind of passionate, and he's walking faster, and he's schooling me on all these issues. And, what I didn't do is what he expected, which was debate him, because there's no point, right? So I listened. On an occasion, I would ask a clarifying question, because he would say something, and I'd say, so this is acceptable in your community, but this isn't. Okay, well, that's interesting. And so I would do that. And so we continued to walk, and at some point, it was really interesting. And again, I didn't really necessarily anticipate this, but this is sort of my experience of what happened, is that he rode this kind of fever wave of rage and anger and put in all this stuff. But because I didn't dance with him, I just listened and asked for clarification now and then. He followed the arc into a point where he started to come to his own understanding of his own doubts, of his own position, his own, And so he'd say, should I vote for this guy again? Probably not. He was stupid to do this and go after this guy. And that was, and alienate women is stupid. So it was really interesting because I didn't provide the critique, he did,
Yeah.
And that, again, just the doing of that opened me up, because he was able to then be more honest about his ambivalences and all of that. So at this point, we're walking. We'd walk through the park. We're sort of heading back towards our building, and I said, I know that you want, your wife's not feeling well, and so if you want, we can head back. He said, we can walk a few more blocks. So we did. We kind of walked, and then we ended up back home, and I had a copy of my book, which I gave to him, and I said, look, you don't have to read this, for God's sake, but I wanted you to have some sense of why I'm doing this. And so he picked up the book. I'm going to do a show and tell. This is the book. And he turned it over and he said, Polarization. He said, yeah. He said, I don't know what to do about this. He said, I feel like I'm just constantly enraged and lost in the forest. I really don't know what to do about this problem. And I said, well, I think what we just did is what we have to keep doing, right? Is we have to try to have conversations that open us up to some degree to each other. And he agreed and he left. And then, the end of this, the postscript to this is that about 2 weeks later, he was on the elevator and my son walked on. My son is about 27. They'd never spoken before. They'd seen each other before, but he'd never said a word to my son. And he looked at him and he said, You're Peter's son, right? And my son said, yeah. He was nervous. And he said, tell your father that I'm reading his book, and it's not bad. And I thought, that's what should be here. It's not bad. It's the best endorsement I could have. And I do want to say, as a postscript, one of the things that's important about these kinds of experiments or adventures that we take is that they're not going to fix anything. They're not going to change anything dramatically, but they did shift our relationship. And what happened since then, this is, as I said, a couple of years ago, is that we've had more contact. We've met several times. And part of it is like he has a son who's, they're an Orthodox family, and he has a son that applied to Columbia Law School. And so when the divisions were happening, their family was really anxious about a kid with a keppa going to Columbia. And they reached out to me and said, what's going on there? And is this safe? And so I met with the family and listened to their concerns. And I happened to be part of a task force addressing it, so I could sort of give them some, alleviate some of their anxiety. But so it opened up a different channel for us. I'm sure he voted for Trump again. I'm sure. I mean, I don't know how he feels about it right now, given the stock market. But it changed the nature of our relationship. That it's not just about Trump and politics, but it thickened the relationship and it opened us up. And that's the best we can do, right? Is sort of keep the conversation going. And so I use that as an illustration of what we can do. If you do it, I recommend you prepare for it. You do it intentionally and thoughtfully. And, there are 5 or 6 things there on a website. We have 6 things to do if you want to go for a walk with somebody that you're estranged from, which is just how to prepare for it and what to do. And it sort of goes through a similar kind of story. But so you don't want to jump into these things because they're not going to go well. That. And you can't really trust yourself unless you're prepared enough to help guide the process well enough that it can continue. And that's what ideally all of us can do.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, it reminds me, I was gifted a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey when I was, one of my earliest mentors when I was about 21 years old.
Yeah.
Habit number 4 is to seek first to understand before being understood.
Yeah.
Which is, it seems like since Mr. Covey's passed away, everyone's forgotten that habit, which is what you just described. Rather than bringing all your ideas, it's just bringing your inquiry, just bringing your sense of curiosity to understand that person's point of view. Yeah. And interestingly, then as you demonstrated, they then asked about yours. It's a natural process if we allow it to be.
It's true. If we can tap into that and sort of shift the dynamic away from what we know is not helpful, it can make a difference. Yeah.
There's another old school book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. That entire book is based on just simply understanding the other person and showing massive in them.
There's a documentary called Fog of War, which is about JFK's defense secretary, Robert McNamara, who got us into the Vietnam War. And he, was a very smart young man. Then the Vietnam War happened. And at some point, he kind of crashed. He got very depressed, became suicidal. He was hospitalized for a while. And then at some point, somebody does a documentary with him about his learnings from his time as defense secretary. And I think learning number 1 was empathize with your enemy. Because he said what happened was they had all kinds of information from the ambassadors, that knew the North Vietnamese, that understood the culture, that understood what they were doing. They didn't pay any attention to it. They went on their assumptions about what was happening, and they got us into something they never should have gotten us into because the North Vietnamese were not looking for this fight. And again, this is 50 years later or whatever that he's, coming to this realization. But it is learning number 1. The more you can establish an understanding and a connection and really try to understand them, the more you can avoid the worst.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to ask you one closing question before we wrap up, which is if someone was to listen to this in 5 years' time, 2030, what would you hope people look back and see has changed in the world since this initial conversation we had today?
That's a good question. Again, I do hope that we move from these extremes to more of a process of check and balance and more of a respect and appreciation for what other sides represent in this world. And I think our capacity to do that as individuals in our families and communities, I think it's got to start there. One of the principles that I do stress in the book is it's called, some call it positive deviance. It's really looking for the people, it's looking for the parts of yourself that are your best self. But it's also, when I went on this walk with my neighbor beforehand, I thought, well, who do I know that would do this well? And there's a guy named Andrea Bartoli, who's a world-class peacemaker. There's my brother, who's a seminarian. There are 2 or 3 people I thought of, if they did this, this is how they would start it. And so find those people. and find the people and the groups that are doing great things and lean into them. They provide a source of, hope and possibility, and they can model good things. And while our leaders are fumbling or worse, we have to find these people locally. And the more we can do that, the more we can rekindle that spirit, I think, in this country and in this world.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for this illuminating discussion today. We've referenced a lot of things, including your book today, so please do check the comments below. We'll include the links to Peter's book, the article he talked about, but there was also a number of other sources that were referenced throughout this discussion, so look out for those in the comments below, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify. We'll have those beneath today's conversation. So thank you very much. And my call to action to everyone at home is what can you do to help put into practice what we've discussed today and actually help to break down that polarization. Having just come back from holiday and realizing I'm part of the problem in some cases what I'm doing here. So it's how do I help break that? And that's my invitation to everyone at home. What role can you play at home? What difficult conversation can you have tomorrow to help bridge the divide and find a way to seek a deeper understanding and break down this polarization? So thank you, Peter, for being with us today and helping us understand why this is happening and also offering a glimmer of what is possible when we choose a different approach.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I appreciate your platform. I appreciate you giving these ideas, these methods some, attention, and thank you for what you do.
If you've made it all the way to the end of this important conversation, it means you're one of the few who isn't afraid to question, to listen, and to think deeply in a time of increased noise and division. Peter T. Coleman reminded us today that the way out of polarization isn't through shouting louder, it's through engaging smarter. And this begins with understanding the forces shaping how we think, how we relate, and how we respond. And this is exactly why we created the Thinking Society course. It's a 6-week learning experience designed to help you to break free from groupthink, challenge unconscious bias, and sharpen your ability to think clearly when outrage and polarization distort the truth. You'll learn from a world-class faculty, explore psychological and social forces influencing belief, and join a community committed to reclaiming independent thought in an age of conformity. Go to weareelevate.org/thinking society to find out more. And if this conversation resonated with you, then please subscribe to the show. Share this episode with someone who's tired of the noise and ready for real dialogue, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks once again for being part of this mission. And until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, live free, and prosper.